Happy week 4, everybody. Attached to this video, I have a form for you to fill out. I'd like you to take the time to do that if you can. It just gives me a sense of things that you've enjoyed about this class so far and things that you might like to see me do differently or change. While there are evaluations at the end of the semester to fill out, giving me that information sooner helps you out a lot more to kind of get a sense of what this class is doing for you, things that I could do differently, etc. So making sure that the class fits with you and helps with your learning is helpful, and I'm happy to make additional changes and ways to kind of facilitate that learning for this class. Now that we're in week 4 and chapter 3, you should be in a pretty good groove right now. I will tell you that chapter 4 and starting to get into the Tolman model is something that will be really helpful as you start working on your argument diagramming and other assignments in the class, because the Tolman model kind of lays out the parts of an argument that you'll be able to use for that and other assignments. So you might also want to start thinking about what topic might interest you, for instance, on your topic paper. I will tell you that while I'm really interested in a variety of topics, the 3 topics that I will generally kind of discourage you from doing because they have been incredibly overused are abortion, gun control, and marijuana. It's not that you can't do those topics, but if you do, maybe try to bring it to the table in a unique way. So maybe focus on a specific type of gun or a specific type of gun control, or maybe you focus on the specific use of marijuana in a context. So if you're going for one of those topics, try to make it unique or different, because otherwise those topics have been really, really overdone. So getting into this chapter and on chapter 3, in previous chapters we talked about the ways in which individuals make arguments. So when you all looked at Powell's speech, for instance, the reasonableness of the argument was the extent to which appropriate decision makers, so for in this instance members of the UN, felt that the argument made by Powell fulfilled their criteria, the concerns that they were making, and the basis on which they made decisions. In this chapter, we get into a lot of different ways in which individuals come to reach arguments. So what particular criteria and views do people have? What kind of criteria do they have in order to make arguments? And that's important for you because you need to make arguments effectively that fit with the particular values and beliefs that people have. So this chapter gets into some of the ways that that happens. One of the ways that that happens is through a discussion of good story, or the use of narrative argumentation. So if you think about a narrative, the textbook lays out, for instance, having characters, having some sort of plot, or some sort of endpoint. Narratives are really persuasive. Think about, for instance, movies that are able to really get us on board and get us interested in various things. So for instance, if you watch a superhero movie, you identify with the character and maybe with the struggles that they have and so forth. And maybe that convinces you to believe in yourself or to work hard or something like that. So the use of narratives and stories and argumentation is really effective because it shows people and gets them on board with what sort of change you're looking for. So similarly, right, good reasons and the use of arguments that fit within the criteria of the decision makers is talked about in this chapter 2. Another thing that's talked about is the use of science and scientific argumentation. So if we think about science as a method, right, science generally says we have knowledge, things that we know about the world, but there's a gap, there's a problem. So maybe we don't know what happens if we cross-pollinate this flower with this flower, right? What do the 2 flowers together ultimately cause? So in order to answer that question, a scientist might conduct an experiment. So they might manipulate and do an experimental group against a control group, and they might record data, reach conclusions, and as a result of the conclusions, right, they come back and they expand on the general knowledge and information that we have on that topic. And that's kind of how the scientific process has worked. There's a gap, that gap gets addressed through research and through study. Thus, we have more information. So, oftentimes in scientific argumentation, it is drawing from that existing body of knowledge. So that's kind of one framework that's used to kind of look into that form of argumentation. Another type of argumentation is feminist argumentation. And that's really tricky because as the book discusses, there's no single definition of feminism, and there is not one feminism. Rather, there are multiple feminisms. So for instance, if we think about three major waves in feminism, the first wave was generally focused on women's suffrage, the right to vote, very kind of fundamental rights in that regard. The second wave focused a lot more on kind of expanding women's rights and accessibility. And then the third wave, or the most common one, has focused more on women's rights in intersectional contexts. So for instance, what does it mean for experiences of women of color? What does it mean for instance, women of sexual minorities? What does it mean for the experiences of trans women, for instance? So third wave feminism is generally focused on those things. Additionally, right, you have, for instance, intersectional feminism, so focused on the intersections or the variety of aspects of identity, including gender, race, class, nationality, disability, etc., that go into making identity. So there are a lot of different aspects that kind of come together. In the context of argumentation, this argumentation style generally suggests that things like personal testimony and personal stories are kind of left out of normal normative ways of engaging in argumentation. Feminist studies in communication and in argumentation specifically also talk about the ways in which gender being, right, how somebody identifies their gender and performs that gender, and sexual orientation kind of relate to argumentation as well. So the ways in which, for instance, it might be argued that for women, experiences and economic opportunities might have greater limitations and problems. That would be an example of that type of argumentation in action. Additionally, a major tenet that gets talked about related to feminist argumentation is alternative dispute resolution. And this is a really important concept because there are a variety of different ways to resolve arguments and points of tension that don't necessarily rely on rhetoric, right? So an answer, a response, and a debate that happens between those three things, or between those two sides. And there are three different types of alternative dispute resolution strategies. The first one is arbitration. Now, arbitration involves a formal body or some sort of individual who arbitrates and makes the final call. So if I said, you know, my friend and I can't decide where we're going to eat, and so I bring in a third person and I ask them to make the call for me, that's arbitration. It's taking another body, so for instance, like the Supreme Court, to ultimately render a decision that resolves that scenario. The second type of alternative dispute resolution strategy is mediation. You can think about mediation in the context of kind of like dialectic, about having a conversation, kind of reaching a conclusion through both sides taking action and engaging with each other. So that third party person, rather than making that decision, is helping to mediate the conflict. A really good example of this is couples counseling. So a couple comes in, maybe they have marital problems, and the couples counselor mediates and talks through a conflict and helps both of them reach a solution. So the counselor isn't an authority, they're not the one making the decision, but they can assist in the decision-making process. Finally, negotiation involves both of the sides coming to the table and kind of reaching some sort of solution. That's where we see things like compromise happen a lot. So if, for instance, the two political parties are having major disagreements about healthcare, then mediation, or rather negotiation, might involve both of them negotiating, horse trading, kind of trying to decide what areas of common ground they might have, and thus reaching a solution together that works with those things. So that kind of fits with the context of consensus, or both sides reaching a general agreement on something that might happen too. So those are the major concepts of this chapter. This chapter really tries to get into kind of some ways of thinking about and framing certain arguments. And remember that that's really important as you're thinking about what criteria decision makers are using to evaluate arguments. And based on whether or not the argument follows that criteria, if that argument is reasonable or ultimately effective.